For now, I would just like to welcome Volodymyr Sheiko, who's the director of the Ukrainian Institute, and he's going to speak to us today about the Ukraine and Russian conflict. Let me just stop sharing and mute myself. Thank you, Volodymyr. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lorna. Can you hear me? Okay. Great. First of all, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak to you. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing war and an invasion of Russia in Ukraine, I couldn't join you in person, but it's a delight to be able to join you online from a relatively safe space. Can I share my screen, right? Okay, great. Right, so my presentation and my speech would be about reconciliation and decoloniality in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine today. Before the war started, I hoped to be able to speak to you about the very concrete projects that Ukraine has been doing to make sense of the developments of the past 8 years and the annexation of the parts of its territories, and various cultural and artistic projects that tried to make sense of what was going on and how Ukraine was dealing with that experience and how Ukraine was healing through that experience. But since the Russian invasion of the 24th of February, I just decided to think a little bit about how peace building and reconciliation might look in the future when this war is over. And to discuss this complex topic a bit prematurely, I would suppose, I think it's essential to understand the nature of the conflict. Because contrary to the public opinion, to the popular opinion, this war didn't start on the 24th of February. It began actually in March 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine and occupied Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine. But some go as far as early 20th century, when Ukraine briefly achieved its independence and after the breakup of empires during and after World War I. But broadly speaking, this struggle between Russia and Ukraine has been going on for as long as the Ukrainian and Russian statehood coexisted and influenced each other for centuries. And Russia's attempts to pacify Ukraine, to consume, to homogenize, to subdue, to colonize Ukraine, have been going on for centuries. And I would go as far as saying that they're an essential part of Russian political identity today. In his infamous article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, published in July 2021, Vladimir Putin made it very clear that the Russian geopolitical project is impossible without Ukraine. So I argue that Russia's invasion of Ukraine today is a neo-colonial war, a way, an attempt to restore Russia's imperial geopolitical blueprint. And contrary to that, Ukraine's resistance is a decolonial struggle to break away from the former empire and to build a standalone political nation. And just a few numbers, very recent polls show that there is an overwhelming support today among Ukrainians for EU and NATO membership. And similarly, very high support in Russia goes to Putin, his policies, and his so-called special military operation in Ukraine, which to me is a demonstration, is a proof that both countries' existential objectives are mutually exclusive. Which means that any reconciliation that may begin between Ukraine and Russia is impossible today. It will be impossible for a very long time. And it hurts me to say this because as a cultural diplomacy professional, as cultural relations professional, I have always believed in the power of arts and culture, in mutual understanding, in peace building, in reconciliation. But having experienced this myself and having looked at what war can do to my own country, I have changed my opinion, and I now understand how far from any meaningful and true reconciliation these two countries are. It's very important also to discuss what attempts are now being made to bring Ukrainians and Russians together in a meaningful dialogue. And a lot of Western institutions in Europe and the US have taken liberties to initiate such dialogue and to invite speakers from both countries and impose a framework that, in my opinion, is deeply colonial in its nature. Because I argue that we cannot discuss reconciliation without discussing and rethinking the whole structure and the whole framework of dialogue that is now is possible between Ukraine and Russia. It is Ukraine that has to give consent and participate in every single such discussion. We must introduce new vocabulary that is a decolonial, a post-colonial vocabulary that rethinks structures, hierarchies, that rethinks what is a center and what is a periphery, what is a great culture and what is a lesser culture in a way. It's very symptomatic how a lot of Western institutions refuse now to suspend any cultural cooperation with the Russian state, because they still feel a very strong sentiment for the untouchable great Russian culture. The German pen went as far as to issue a statement titled "The enemy is Putin, not Pushkin." However, even in this dynamic, there is very little interest to explore Ukrainian culture and cultures of other countries that have been invisible and silenced in imperial shadows. So hardly anyone, in my opinion, is really willing to rethink that cultural canon and the hierarchies of dialogue that are essentially constructs of our colonial past. So any attempt, I argue, to reconcile Ukrainians and Russians today and in the foreseeable future based on the current frameworks will mean a new round of recolonization of Ukraine on Western and Russian terms. They would mean unwillingness to rethink structures that have existed in international discourse for decades. And I think that there are a lot of challenges ahead for the post-colonial studies in this context, which simply put mean how to make sense of Russia after the war in Ukraine, how to devise new paradigms and new ways of thinking across a variety of different disciplines that include political science, economics, international law, humanities, particularly history or culture, and how those findings, discussions, academic research, how that breadth of new knowledge could lead to solutions, to practical solutions, to very practical ideas that can be implemented in policies, in mindsets, in mental maps of people living in different countries, to enable a new quality, a new dynamic of reconciliation dialogue. And I would like to conclude with also a probably controversial argument that to me, cultural diplomacy and cultural relations have always been seen as an instrument of building trust and understanding, of engaging in a dialogue in extreme occasions where all other options of dialogue have been exhausted. And I think it's time to rethink that function too, because before Russia fully withdraws from Ukraine, before Russia rethinks itself, before Russia changes its way, the way it looks at its colonial legacy and colonial past, before there is a new democratic government in Russia that acknowledges all the war crimes committed in Ukraine, and before an international tribunal, international court of justice holds Russia accountable for these war crimes, cultural diplomacy will not serve as an instrument of dialogue. It will serve as an instrument of deterrence, an instrument to protect Ukrainian identity from its aggressive neighbor, to protect all those achievements that Ukraine has demonstrated over the past 30 years of its new independence. So cultural diplomacy, ironically, will be a safeguard rather than a proactive means to openness and to dialogue. But once Russia transforms, only then we can meaningfully talk. I will conclude with this. Thank you very much for your attention. You can see my contact details on the screen, and I will be happy to answer questions after the other presentations. Thank you.